I think one of the things that makes it so hard is, of course, that it's a topic that we're really not at all familiar with. Like, we look in the mirror and that's about all we know about it. This is kind of like a physics, science-ish one on a very strange topic. We don't even think of mirrors as being physics related at all. I also think one thing that makes it hard is that we've got a lot of different unfamiliar terminology that's referring to the same thing. Like, they have 3 different ways to refer to each of the 2 major viewpoints. I do see there being 2 different viewpoints here. You probably saw some contrasts here between 2 different sides. The first paragraph is talking about the field of sight explanation. Then the remainder of the passage is talking about this other explanation called front to back, explaining how mirrors work. So the first paragraph, they're talking, again, 3 different ways about the same thing. Field of sight in lines 12 to 13, field of sight, they lay it out there, but they also say left to right. They also say rotating around a vertical axis. So those are all related to viewpoint 1, all saying exactly the same thing. And that's, of course, the viewpoint the author likes. Then they go on to talk about the second viewpoint, viewpoint 2, the other side. Hey, Jacob, come on in. Good morning. All right, so viewpoint 1 here is field of sight, which is also left to right, also vertical. Then viewpoint 2 is the other side. Maybe I'll circle this to indicate this is what the author likes. Viewpoint 2, the other side, is the front to back. And this one is associated with our mental constructs. And this is also associated with observer phenomena. So whenever you see one of these terms, you can equate it with the others and just read it however you'd like best. I think you want to focus on the first ones I listed for each, because that's how they're typically most often referred to throughout the passage. But know that when they talk about this, they're talking about this. When they talk about vertical, they're talking about field of sight. So just always have in mind referring it back to one of those 2, I think, makes this a little bit more relatable. The other thing you want to think about, of course, is that this passage is very confusing. It's very tempting to just kind of skip the parts you don't get and go on to the questions, but that'll likely only further complicate things. So I'd recommend slowing down and taking the time to actually understand what they're saying. And if you can define these things in these terms for yourself, I think it'll become a little bit more clear. Now, in terms, if you were road mapping this with the viewpoint 1, viewpoint 2, evidence 1, evidence 2, I didn't mark it up with every single one. I kind of did only a little bit. I marked V1, viewpoint 1 in lines 12 to 13. I marked A2 in line 14. I marked V2 in line 16, V1 in 22, V1 in 28. And then I kind of stopped there. Just in terms of how I marked this up. If you want to do more or less, totally fine. The key thing is really just getting that they're making these 2 distinctions, and the author likes viewpoint 1, and most of the passage is devoted to why viewpoint 2, the front to back explanation, is wrong. Everyone with me so far? All right, so that's pretty much all I would do at the outset here. I would then, just having a good sense of these 2 sides and knowing that the author is making various arguments against viewpoint 2 and knowing where to find those when you need to. Going on to the questions now, I like to do questions in the order that works for me. So global, general, main idea, primary purpose, passage organization, then detail-oriented ones, then more inferential, most supported questions that involve more reading between the lines. So I will jump around a little bit here, but I think that, of course, it's nice. Number 20 starts us off with a main point question. What's the main point of the passage? Now, I might think as a prephrase, well, field of sight is good, front to back is bad. Unfortunately, they don't give it to us quite that simply, so we have to simply scan through the choices to see what might hit. Now, I think we can eliminate some things, though. I mean, E certainly I would eliminate off the bat. Extremely complicated. It's very rare that someone talking on the LSAT is going to lack confidence in what they're saying. They're going to usually have some sort of opinion. so E is out. D, subject to debate, I think is somewhat tempting, but they are clearly coming down in favor of one side over the other. So even if it's true that it is subject to debate, is that why the author wrote this? Is this what they wanted to get across? C must be determined by physicists. They talk about physicists, but it's not as if they're talking all about the importance of physicists particularly. Then B, leaving it open-ended, yet to be determined. That's again kind of like ambiguity similar to E, saying it's hard, it's complicated. They do have a strong opinion. They are coming down in favor of one side. So by elimination, A. Then if we look at A, where's the support for A? I would find it in line 50. If we consider both what mirrors do and what happens when we look into mirrors. From there, those are the two particular elements they're looking for here. And of course, they're saying that viewpoint 2, front to back, falls short on that because it's not actually describing what they really do. It's a mental construct. So that's number 20. I would then look for other general-oriented questions to see if they can help guide us in any way here. I think number 24 is also fairly general or global in nature, and so I would do that one next. The author primarily concerned with what? Well, they're concerned with saying why field of sight is good and why front to back is bad. So I'd look for them saying that they're dismissing one in favor of the other. That would be my prephrase going in here. So looking for those, I think A, experimental evidence. There's no experiments being run here. This is all theoretical. So that would be out. B, different explanations based on different observations. Again, not going about in favor of one versus the other. C, it does technically describe some of the difficulties, like we talked about in number 20. It has to meet those two criteria. But is that what the author is primarily concerned with doing, is just defining what a proper solution involves? No, they're saying that they do define it in order to then they define what a proper solution involves in order to better support field of sight and knock out front to back. So I'd knock out C as well. D matches the prephrase pretty closely. Why front to back falls short and why field of sight is good. And of course, D only covers half of that, why front to back is bad, but I think that's fine overall. If we really look at the amount or the percentage of text here devoted to one viewpoint over the other, they're devoting the vast majority to viewpoint 2. So they don't need to cover viewpoint 1 as well in choice D here. Also keep in mind that reading comp really more than any other section is the best of the worst. So you can work by elimination, that's fine. The correct answer does not have to match your perfect prephrase. It could be technically correct, even if it's not comprehensive. I'll often see in passage organization questions where they won't cover every single thing that happened in the passage. They'll cover maybe the 3 biggest out of 5, but they're not mentioning the other 2. That still does not necessarily make it wrong, though. So that's D, and then E, relating theoretical support to the acceptance. They're talking theory here, but I don't really think they're talking about anyone accepting anything. They're really just talking about their own opinions here and knocking out other sides. And of course, this doesn't relate to viewpoint 1 versus viewpoint 2. So I'd knock that out. Then beyond that, I think I would save 25 for last because it's so general in nature, no clear starting point. Other than that, I'd probably just go through the questions in the order given, just to be simple. So that's what I'll do here. 22, mental constructs. So if you're not sure what mental constructs are, I think it's worth, again, kind of dumbing it down for yourself to make it more relatable. Mental construct is just mental, how you think about things. So whenever you see that, if you want to make it simpler, just rephrase it with that in mind. So mental constructs over primary senses, so our thoughts versus what we actually see with our eyes. Why is that useful? And that's talked about, of course, when they're talking about the front to back explanation, that we don't really process things in the way that we actually see them. We see the chair inside the mirror, for example, rather than just a simple reflection that's more technical in nature. And so I'd be relating it to front to back specifically, not the field of sight. And we do have this coming up at the beginning of the 3rd paragraph where they talk about mental constructs, lines 29 to 30. That's our support there for choice B, front to back explanation here. top to bottom is a total non sequitur. That was mentioned once in line 3. At first, when I saw this here, I was like, did I miss something? Should I add that there? But no, that's not even in the running here. So that's out.
How often are you going back to the passage when you're answering questions?
That's a great question. I think for the global ones, I'm not going back at all if I can help it. But for the detailed ones, I might. For me, looking at number 22, I probably wouldn't go back for that one because I associate mental constructs to front to back automatically. So when I see mental constructs, I'm thinking those are used to help to explain why we process front to back.
It can be difficult with the global questions when, like you said, they sometimes don't cover everything in the passage. So I get to an answer choice and I'm like, that's kind of what they're doing. But then my tendency is to go back and be like, oh, what's missing from that answer? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I can see what you're saying. I think in general, if you walk away from the passage with the main idea, that also will give you some sense of the flow of the passage as well. So reading this, I see they start off introducing viewpoint 1, field of sight. Then everything else about that is basically introducing this viewpoint 2, front to back, and why it's wrong. And then finally, the criteria for what a good explanation would involve. So that's my overall takeaway from this. And in a way, I memorized it so that can inform my decisions for all the global questions. So I'm not going to go back for any of them, honestly, the global ones. But the detailed ones, I would go back. And the idea is that also you have an idea of where to go when you need to. So again, my roadmap is simply viewpoint 1, then viewpoint 2, why viewpoint 2 is bad, what a good explanation. That's my roadmap. And I'm not necessarily writing it down, but that's my general flow. And that kind of matches with the 4 paragraphs, actually. But I know mental constructs, viewpoint 2. I'm going to go where they talked about viewpoint 2 specifically, and I'm going to look for mental constructs. I'll just scan for those keywords. Going on to 23, the author believes front to back is what? Well, they don't like front to back. So I'd look for something negative, or at least saying that it's not technically correct. And so I'd scan through the choices saying I'm kind of surprised to see, oh, successful, but they don't like it. So why are all the choices saying successful? And so I wouldn't think automatically that my understanding is wrong. I would, of course, look at the entire answer choice, not simply the beginning of it. So scanning through, I'd look for something that ideally is saying it's successful, but maybe not completely, or qualifying that in some way. And keep in mind also that a lot of times on reading comp, they do qualify things. They're not usually extreme in one direction or the other. So given that, it's okay for them to acknowledge some of the strengths of front to back, even if they don't like it overall. And keeping in mind number 20, our answer there, 2 particular elements, back to line 50, maybe front to back is good on one of those things, but not the other, of course. And so automatically, A, B, and C are out. I'm starting, or maybe not eliminated entirely, but at least starting to look at D and E because at least they're qualifying directly the success of front to back. And so that brings us to E, successful only to a point because it does not include what happens when we look into a mirror, meaning it's missing what happens when we look into mirrors, the second part of what's the sentence in line 50, but we also have support for that in the beginning of paragraph 3, 26 to 28, successful to a point. And if you remembered successful in paragraph 3, then that would line up and maybe you'd automatically go to that section when you're looking at the word successful in question 23. Then D, talking about traditional explanations. I don't even remember seeing the word traditional here. Maybe it appeared, but that certainly isn't something I'd be focusing on. Any other questions on that one? All right, then let's go to 25 since we already did 24. This is a general inferential question that requires a little bit of reading between the lines. It's tougher. In some cases, maybe I would save this one for last, but we could tackle it now. Author most likely to agree overall, very open-ended, no clear jumping off point. I would simply scan through the choices here. So A is talking about better optical equipment in experiments. That's totally out of left field. I don't even remember them talking about experiments like I said. This is more theoretical with physics. B, explanations generally fail because they overlook the differences between objects and reflections of objects. That could maybe fit a little bit with why front to back is wrong, but I think that's more specific than what the passage was actually talking about here. So I go ahead to C. One explanation reveals a tendency to separate the phenomenon to be explained from the observer of the phenomenon. So observer phenomenon separation, that's over here, and we have support for that in the beginning of paragraph 4, where they talked about separating observer from phenomenon. That's the match, putting it within the front to back category. And so when they say that one explanation is the front to back explanation. Any questions on this one? Anything you might have found tempting otherwise? What? Yeah, E. I think E is pretty tempting as well. Considering objects to be mental constructs interferes. Yes, that does interfere, but interfere with what is the key? It's the final part of E that goes wrong when they say understanding of how primary perceptions function. It's not about primary perceptions functioning, it's about how mirrors function. So those last few words of E is what makes E wrong. It's not anything about our perceptions being incorrect there, or there being a disconnect between those two things. It's about how mirrors work specifically. Then 26, field of sight. What does the author agree with? Of course, the author likes the field of sight explanation specifically. So I'd be looking, that would be my preface, is that this explanation is good or better than the front to back explanation. I'd scan for a choice, looking for a match there. And we do get that with B. This explanation is good, it just doesn't depend on a false premise. They like field of sight, they're only criticizing front to back, so I think this is perfect. Then finally, 27, detail question. They mention that we rarely focus on our eyes on mirrors in order to what? So this is like a logical reasoning role of the statement question. Why did they make this statement? What are they trying to get across? So if we go back to lines 39 to 40, just to get a little bit of context there, they say that we almost never focus our eyes, which of course impacts our primary perception. And we're really looking inside it, but we're coming up with our own ideas about what's in there. So, of course, like we're seeing the chair inside the mirror. And so we have a mental construct about where we place meaning on what we see there. So again, looking for a choice along those lines. And the lack of focus means that we're not actually seeing it, or at least not processing it, but we're instead interpreting it for ourselves. And so C matches with this, mirrors simulating a three-dimensional reality, even though, of course, they're not really three-dimensional. We're not really focusing on the details of what's happening within it. We're instead constructing it for ourselves with the mental construct. Very tough passage, very tough. I think this is one of the hardest in recent memory. The idea is, again, to slow down and divide them up into each of the two viewpoints so that you can equate them when you need to, because they do use a lot of these things interchangeably throughout.
Can you talk about D for the last question?
Yeah, sure. That we typically deal directly with mental constructs, that's pretty strong. So I guess that's going beyond just the mirror in particular to, in general, overall, in everyday life. So I guess I would ask for that one, where's the support for it to talk about what typically happens overall? They say in line 29, we are accustomed to dealing with our mental constructs, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we typically do. Then the question is why the question specifically here is why they mention that we rarely focus our eyes specifically. So the answer to 27 is C. But I guess the question is here for 27, why does the author mention this fact specifically? What are they trying to get across? And so they're trying to get across the idea that mirrors are a mental construct, or at least the idea that mirrors are a mental construct, then we're not really processing things directly. We're seeing what we think or expect to be there And that's how we understand it versus what's actually there.
Yeah, I guess the sentence before it, like, indeed, mirrors are designed to make a two-dimensional surface appear to have depth.
Yeah. So the idea, so again, this is specific to mirrors in particular, and then C is talking in general terms, which relates more back to line 29, which is something separate altogether, and accustomed to and typically are not the same degrees of strength. I think accustomed to is a bit more moderate. But I think this is a passage where it's worth spending at least three and a half minutes at minimum just to try and get a sense of what the passage is saying. Again, of course, not all passages are equal in difficulty. Some are harder than others, and so if you can get through another one in less than 8:45, you have more time to devote to the tougher one later. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them, and feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.